Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Center for American Progress and the Legal Defense Fund for our event, Winning the Fight for Voting Rights, State Voting Rights Acts. My name is Rebecca Mears, and I'm Director of the Democracy Policy Team at the Center for American Progress. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. Unfortunately, the fight for voting rights continues today. The freedom to vote is under attack across the country, especially for Black voters and other voters of color. Making matters worse, courts have stripped federal voting laws of critical protections, leaving voters without the tools necessary to defend against these attacks. It is critical that Congress pass federal legislation to help restore and bolster the freedom to vote. While legislation awaits action in Congress, states can join the growing movement to protect the freedom to vote and remove barriers to the ballot box by enacting their own voting rights acts, known as state voting rights acts. We'll discuss these in detail today, but before we begin our programming, let me give you a brief overview. First, we'll have keynote remarks from two champions of the freedom to vote, Congresswoman Terry Sewell and Governor Tim Walz. After their remarks, we'll watch the premiere of the brand new monthly video explainer series that LDF and CAP have partnered to produce. After this, we'll bring in Adam Leos from LDF to cover results from a brand new national polling about state voting rights acts. Finally, we'll bring in additional experts from LDF for a panel discussion. So please, stick around as there's a lot of exciting ground to cover today. Without further ado, it is my absolute honor to turn it over to our two keynote speakers, starting with Congresswoman Sewell.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Terry Sewell, and I proudly represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, which includes the historic cities of Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I'm also the proud author and lead sponsor of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in the House of Representatives. I want to thank my friends at Legal Defense Fund and the Center for American Progress for hosting this event. You all have been champions in the fight for voting rights, and I'm honored to be your partner in Congress. It was in my hometown of Selma, Alabama, almost 60 years ago, where foot soldiers like John Lewis marched, bled, and some even died for the equal right of all Americans to vote. Their courage brought us the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and paved the way for greater representation for African Americans and other minority communities. But today, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has come under attack in courtrooms all across this nation. Without its protections, extremists have been working overtime to erect new barriers to the ballot box. Sadly, we know that threats to the VRA will only worsen under this new administration and its Project 2025. Congress must act to address these threats by passing the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore and strengthen the protections of the Voting Rights Act. At the same time, states must take up the mantle and protect the rights of their own voters. State VRAs can make a real and immediate difference in the fight for voting rights. They can provide critical protections for Black and minority voters while Congress finds the will to act. For example, states like New York and Connecticut have already enacted pre-clearance protections at the state level while we fight to restore them federally. These new laws will complement a restored and strengthened VRA. They are narrowly tailored to address local needs, and they will give voters the opportunity to protect themselves in state court. Thanks to the work of amazing activists, policymakers, and state leaders, a state VRA has been enacted every year since 2018, except for the pandemic year of 2020. And each time, we build critical momentum toward passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in Congress. I'm especially excited that state VRAs have now been introduced in the South, including Florida and my home state of Alabama. To be clear, these laws won't pass overnight, but they can help us assert a positive vision as voting rights advocates work to fend off more attacks. These are challenging times for Black voters and anyone who believes in the sanctity of the vote. But the state VRA strategy provides a cause for hope and a path forward as we work to restore federal protections. Make no mistake, our fight for federal voting rights legislation is not over. I look forward to reintroducing the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in the 119th Congress, and I will not give up until it passes and is signed into law. On the heels of Dr. King's 96th birthday, I am reminded of his words. He taught us that progress is elusive, and every generation must fight to hold on to the progress of the past and work to advance it. With that in mind, I encourage everyone to get involved and stay engaged. Only through our collective action can we make this nation live up to its highest ideals of equality and justice for all. Thanks again to the amazing leaders at LDF and the Center for American Progress. Let's keep up the fight and let's continue to get into some good trouble.
Hi everyone, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz here. We're in a critical moment for states to protect their own voters. State voting right acts are an essential way to make voting more accessible, and that's exactly what we've done in Minnesota. In Minnesota, we're proud to have a strong culture of voting with the highest turnout in the nation. We show up at the polls to stand up for ourselves and those we care about. But the freedom to vote is under attack across this country, even here in Minnesota, and we can't count on current federal law to address these threats. In 2023, a federal court stripped individuals and civil rights organizations in several states, including Minnesota, of the right to file lawsuits under the Federal Voting Rights Act. I was immensely proud to sign the Minnesota VRA into law last year, making Minnesota the 7th state to adopt a state-level Voting Rights Act. Key to our success was a strong, inclusive democracy caucus in our legislature. I want to thank the sponsors, Representative Emma Greenman and Senator Bobby Joe Champion, as well as local voting rights groups and LDF for the leading roles they played in getting this across the finish line. It codified critical, common-sense voting protections into state law, and it protects access to the ballot box for every Minnesotan. These protections are especially critical for communities of color and other historically disenfranchised groups who have had a long faced unequal barriers to voting. Congress should restore the full strength of the federal VRA immediately. And in the meantime, states can move forward to protect their own rights with state voting rights acts. Voting is at the heart of all of our freedoms, and we look forward to seeing other states take action that we've taken here in Minnesota to protect that democracy. Thank you.
Thank you again to Governor Walz and Congresswoman Sewell. I think I can speak for us all today that we thank you for your leadership, vision, all that you've accomplished, and all you continue to fight for. Thank you. So next, we'll transition to show the premiere of a new voting rights explainer video series. LDF and the Center for American Progress have partnered to create a special video series to help explain everything you need to know about how state voting rights acts can protect the freedom to vote from dangerous discriminatory attacks. These videos will feature experts from LDF and CAP, along with experts from organizations including the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Brennan Center for Justice, the Campaign Legal Center, the Harvard Election Law Clinic, LatinoJustice, and the New York Civil Liberties Union. Starting now, today, through June of this year, a new video will be posted online each month so you can learn about different aspects of state voting rights acts, from what they are to how they can protect against things like voter suppression, to what a pre-clearance program is, and to how they can protect against other discriminatory attacks. What you're about to see is the first video in the series. In this video, Patrick Gaspard, President and CEO of CAP, and Janae Nelson, President and Director Counsel of LDF, will introduce you to state voting rights acts, the types of provisions they contain, and why these provisions are important. Let's roll.
Hello, I'm Patrick Gaspard, the President and CEO of the Center for American Progress.
I'm Janae Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund.
Black voters and other voters of color face a dangerous, coordinated assault on our voting rights.
State voting rights acts are critical for protecting the right to vote.
Since voters of color conquered significant obstacles to cast ballots in the 2020 election, hundreds of anti-voting rights bills have been introduced in nearly every state. And since the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, gutted the Voting Rights Act, we lack a full arsenal of federal protections to safeguard the right to vote.
That's where state voting rights acts come in. While federal legislation awaits action in Congress, states are moving forward to protect their own voters from discrimination and to ensure equal access to the ballot.
State VRAs create new legal tools for fighting discriminatory election rules. They will help fill the holes left by the Supreme Court's gutting of the Federal Voting Rights Act.
We need these critical safeguards for voters, which can include protections against voter suppression, which happens when Americans face unfair barriers to the ballot, like long lines at the polls in Black neighborhoods.
Protections against discriminatory gerrymandering that dilutes the participation of minorities. Expanded language accessibility, so citizens like my mom, who don't speak English comfortably, are able to fully participate in our democracy.
Pre-clearance programs, which require local governments with a history of discrimination to prove that certain voting changes won't harm people of color before they can go into effect. Protections against intimidation, deception, or obstruction of voters.
A democracy canon which protects us by instructing judges to interpret statutes in favor of voting rights and equitable access to elections.
The creation of a statewide database to make election data more transparent.
Expanded protections for Americans with disabilities who are more likely to be voters of color.
Protections for Native voters on tribal lands.
State VRAs offer a flexible model so each state can adopt provisions to meet local needs.
That's why, even if federal legislation passes, these acts will remain important.
California, Washington, Oregon, Virginia, New York, and Connecticut have already passed statewide voting rights acts, and more states are following suit.
There's lots of momentum right now, and for the future of our democracy, we need to keep it rolling. To learn more about the essential components of state voting rights acts, check out our websites and follow along with this video explainer series.
I hope you all enjoyed the very first video in the video explainer series that LDF and CAPA partnered to work on. And now we'll get into some more interactive parts of this event today. It is my honor to introduce Adam Leos from LDF, who is going to be covering some new national polling results about state voting rights acts. Adam, take it away.
Hi, my name is Adam Leos, and I lead the Legal Defense Fund's interdisciplinary team working to promote state voting rights acts in states with substantial Black populations and demonstrated need. And after our advocacy to enact the New York Voting Rights Act and the Connecticut Voting Rights Act, we launched a messaging research project with our partners at Impact Research because we had two main goals. If we can put the first slide up, that would be great. Our first goal was to determine how popular state voting rights acts are with the public. We had some indication from our organizing in those places and also from a brief poll that we did in Connecticut that state VRAs were quite popular. And we wanted to see how that would play out nationally with key demographics and also in places that we were going to explore advocacy in the future. Our second goal was to learn how to best talk about state voting rights acts, how to talk about it in key places among key demographics. We realized that we were not basing our advocacy on any evidence-based guidance on how to talk about state VRAs and how that could differ from, for example, how we would talk about voting rights at the federal level. And so we wanted to explore that. We conducted focus groups, and then in July 2024, we launched a national poll with oversamples of key demographics and also in a couple of key places with different political geographies where we were advocates and LDF were exploring state voting rights act work, and that was Michigan and Maryland. And we're happy to provide the resulting messaging guidance to partners who are exploring or actively working on state-level voting rights acts upon request. Today, I want to briefly highlight the findings about how tremendously popular state voting rights acts are across race and other demographics and party lines. So today, I want to say that also you can find the slides that I'm presenting on LDF's State Voting Rights Act landing page, which is being posted in the chat. So on this next slide, we have our key overall finding of the poll, which is that across the board, more than 3/4 of voters support enacting a state voting rights act in their state. 78% support, as well as a majority strongly supporting enacting a state VRA. And then in our next slide, you can see that this support really does transcend demographics. Next slide, please. You can see that this support really does transcend demographic, partisan, and other lines. I would highlight 87% support among Black voters, which is a core constituency for the Legal Defense Fund, 89% support amongst AAPI voters. And as you can see from the cross-partisan support, voting rights doesn't need to be and should not be a partisan issue. This next slide, please, actually contains what I think is our most compelling finding. So about 3/4 of voters across the country want their state representative to prioritize enacting a state-level voting rights act. It's one thing to support a policy, and it's another thing to say that with everything on the table and everything going on, we really want our state representatives to lean in and deliver on a particular policy. And that's what people are asking for on state-level voting rights acts. And that includes 81% of Black voters that want their state representatives to prioritize this. So for us at the Legal Defense Fund, that really confirms that our core constituency is behind this advocacy. And I'll note that on our landing page, there is a polling memo that has more detail that includes some of these demographic breakdowns. And now this final slide, if you can turn to the next slide, summarizes the key findings of our research. So as I mentioned, there's strong support across the board. We also found that voters feel like their voting rights are under attack, both at the national and state levels. And keep in mind, this poll was taken in July of 2024. So with the recent Trump election and his plans through Project 2025 and other attacks, this number is likely only higher now recently. We found that voters feel that it's very important to protect their voting rights. And as I mentioned, nearly 3/4 want their state representatives to prioritize the specific strategy of enacting a state voting rights act. And then finally, we also asked voters about each of the core provisions that Patrick and Janae mentioned in the video, along with a few others. And we found that there's broad and substantial support across all of those key provisions. So at least 2/3 of voters support all of them. And sometimes we had closer to 80% support for some of those key provisions. And again, this detail is in the polling memo that you can find on the LDF landing page. So again, you can find more detail of these slides, the memo on LDF's landing page. Our Michigan specific results are posted on our Michigan landing page. Our Maryland specific results will soon be posted on our Maryland landing page. And partners can reach out directly to us for access to the messaging guidance. And there will be contact information posted at the end of this event for that. So I really want to thank the Impact Research team, as well as my colleagues in the LDF Communications Department for a wonderful partnership to produce these compelling results. And now I want to turn things over to my colleague at LDF, Demetria McCain, to facilitate our panel discussion. And Demetria is the director of our policy team, which is the home of the State Voting Rights Act work at LDF. And she's been a champion of that work since she joined last summer. And I do want to flag that we are not going to have time to take questions on the panel with such a big group. As I mentioned, there'll be contact information at the end where folks can follow up with questions. But with that, Demetria, over to you.
Thank you so much for that, Adam, and appreciate those slides and that information. So as was mentioned, I'm Demetria, Director of Policy here at the Legal Defense Fund, or LDF as we call it. So let me just tell folks who don't know that LDF is actually the nation's premier racial justice legal organization, working for an America where dignity is sacred, power is shared, actually shared, and thriving is the standard. And since our founding by Thurgood Marshall 85 years ago, we've actually worked to protect and expand voting rights for Black communities. Now, as many as you know, last year, we as a country, but particularly us at LDF, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education, a case Thurgood Marshall, who later became Justice Marshall, a case that Thurgood Marshall actually argued himself. But Justice Marshall actually viewed a different LDF victory as his most important one. And that is the case that he won in 1944, which actually ended all white primaries in my own home state of Texas. That case was called Smith v. Allwright. And that was his most important victory because he understood that the importance of Black political power is truly central in the context of the fight for civil rights and social equality. And so this year, we actually celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And now LDF has litigated many seminal voting rights cases under the Voting Rights Act and under the Constitution, I might say. And in fact, we actually will be back at the Supreme Court this year, 2025, defending the ability of Black Louisianans, hello out there, folks from Louisiana, defending the ability of Black Louisianans to elect their preferred candidates in actually 2 congressional districts. It was 1 for a long time, but actually 2. And that finally happened, actually, as a result of the amazing Louisiana partners that we had on the ground, as well as a voting rights case that LDF recently won. So that's a little bit about where we are in this world, and we're deeply rooted in this work. But let's turn a little bit now to state VRAs, which is why we're all here. So along with all those efforts that I just mentioned, we're currently working to restore and to strengthen the federal VRA. And I'm actually thrilled to have heard from Representative Terry Sewell today. She's actually our champion on this effort. But let me just say this. Congress has not found the will to act, folks. And right now, we are seeing voting rights attacks and not progress at the federal level. And so I say all that as we talk about state level voting rights acts. For the past several years, LDF has prioritized state voting rights acts as a key strategy to protecting Black voters. And we are super excited about the momentum that we have seen in this work and that so very many of you have actually joined this webinar today. That's really exciting. There's a lot of you out there. So let's get to the meat of our panel and let's do some learning. How about that? So I'm really excited to introduce this panel of experts we've got. We've got first, you've heard from Rebecca Mears, Director of Democracy at the Center for American Progress. She kicked off the event for us. And then you just heard from my colleague, Adam Liaz. You heard from him all about the new polling that we did. He's our multidisciplinary state VRA team leader here at LDF. And that team has played a key role in passing these state VRAs in New York, in Connecticut, and in Minnesota. And finally, and certainly not least at all, speaking of Louisiana, here she is. I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Candace Batiste. Now, Candace is the campaign strategist at LDF, okay? Candace is an organizer and an attorney who actually played a critical role in enacting the Connecticut VRA. And she's now leading our work to explore state VRA opportunities in the South in our country. And she's also featured, quiet as it's kept, in the video series that we're launching today. So now with such a big group, as Adam mentioned, we're not going to have time for questions, but you can send those in, and we'll follow up and we'll take a look at them. So let's get started. How about that? All right, first, Rebecca, let me turn to you. Now, I talked a lot about LDF's commitment to voting rights and to state VRAs. How does the Center for American Progress come to this work?
Demetria, and thank you, LDF, for all you are doing. So the Center for American Progress is more than just a think tank located in DC. We're an independent, nonpartisan action tank What that means is we're dedicated to improving the lives of all Americans through bold, progressive ideas and action. We've helped push for and achieve progress across a variety of issue areas, from the economy to the environment, healthcare, democracy, and more. But what brings myself and CAP to this work is the simple truth that voting rights is the foundation of every other right. And beyond that, state voting rights acts aren't just a hypothetical ideal. They're not just another white paper. They're not just another suggestion. They are real, achievable policies that states have passed and can pass today to help protect the freedom to vote. And one last thing on that, they also allow for reforming outdated structures in local elections to ensure that Americans can be represented fairly. So I'm very thrilled to be in this fight.
And we're thrilled to have you as a partner in this fight. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Adam, now let's make sure everybody's on the same page here. We saw the video, but please share for those who may have missed the video or maybe we're multitasking. Explain to us exactly what state VRAs are and how does one differ from other voting rights legislation?
Sure. I'm sure that none of the hundreds of folks who are watching are multitasking right now. So a state voting rights act is a piece of state legislation that provides protections against racial discrimination in voting. And these acts are modeled after the Federal Voting Rights Act that we've mentioned. We're currently celebrating the 60th anniversary. They take key provisions in that act, they streamline them, often strengthen them, and then adapt them to state level circumstances. A few examples that we heard about in the video and that we'll further explore in our video explainer series. One is protections against vote dilution. And that happens when an election system is set up in a way that it drowns out the voices of voters of color, so they can't actually practically elect folks, even though they can cast their ballot, they can't practically elect folks who represent them. That's the cases that you mentioned in Alabama and Louisiana are the result of using Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act to assert those protections federally. But vote dilution doesn't just happen in congressional races. It happens throughout local jurisdictions throughout the country. And so state VRAs can be very effective in preventing and remedying those violations. It includes protections against voter suppression. So this is when we have unfair barriers to the ballot. This is also what Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act protects against, and the state voting rights acts contain these protections. Another one I would highlight is the preclearance protection that Janae talked about. And this is modeled on Section 5, which is considered to be the heart of the Federal Voting Rights Act that was gutted by the Shelby County case in 2013. Congresswoman Sewell mentioned that. And New York and Connecticut have now enacted that at the state level. New York's program went into effect in September, so it's active, which is very exciting. And what that does is it prevents discrimination before it occurs. It is based on the very simple principle that when it comes to a matter as fundamental as the right to vote, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So in certain high-risk places, we want to make sure that there's pre-approval by a state authority before jurisdictions can make changes to their laws. And so the key thing here is that the state VRA model is different from some other voting rights legislation that sets affirmative standards for how elections run. So policies like same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, early voting and vote by mail, all those mechanics of elections are absolutely critical. But that's just different than the state VRA model, which focuses on protections against discrimination. For folks who are familiar with legislation at the federal level, you might think about the difference between the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that Congresswoman Sewell mentioned and leads, and the Freedom to Vote Act, which would put in those kinds of basic minimum standards. So whether you vote in Oregon or down in Florida across the country, you're able to have multiple pathways to the ballot. So both of these are critical and essential. The state VRA model is focused on anti-discrimination protections. And the last thing I'd say is that as the folks in the video mentioned, it's a flexible model that can and absolutely must be adjusted according to conditions at the state level. So all of the different prongs won't necessarily make sense in all the places, and many of the prongs need to be adjusted to local circumstances. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all model. It's intended to be taken by advocates locally and matched up with the landscape of discrimination in their own states.
Well, that's a lot. Well, thank you. Now, I know we got people from all over the country here, but can you tell us, if you can, what actually are some of the most common problems that state VRAs address? We got people all
Sure.
over the country here, but what's most common?
Sure. I think the first one I'd mention is underrepresentation at the local level. And this can happen because of skewed districting in county commission offices or city councils, or the prevalent use of what's known as at-large elections, where everyone runs citywide or countywide. And in that situation, when voting preferences tend to break down along racial lines, which is often the case in our country, a slim majority of white voters can actually win all the seats and completely lock out voters of color from having any voice in the process. And we do see this across the country. Just as an example, LDF is working with local partners to enact a Maryland Voting Rights Act. And our partner, the ACLU of Maryland, did some research in the state. And they found that of the counties that have a substantial population of people of color in Maryland, a full 1/3 of those counties lack or have all white government, lack representation for people of color in elected audience. And a quarter of the municipalities with substantial populations of people of color have all white government. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's discrimination happening, but it definitely raises the risk that people of color are being drowned out and not actually able to elect their candidates of choice. And this is often, as I mentioned, the result of at-large elections. So the ACLU also found that more than 60% of municipalities in Maryland that have substantial populations of people of color use at-large elections, which presents that acute risk. So that's the first problem I would highlight. Of course, there is voter suppression, barriers to the ballot, long lines that tend to occur in neighborhoods of color, more so than in white neighborhoods. That happens across the country. And then, of course, in this environment, I would highlight the increasing prevalence of harassment and intimidation for voters. And we have such an intense political environment. And most states do not have a mechanism for voters to protect themselves against voter intimidation in state court. And so state VRAs can provide that. We have protections against inadequate language access that are badly needed. So these are a set of the things that I would highlight as key for problems that we're solving in state VRAs.
But Adam, I heard you mention Maryland. So you're saying that many of these problems aren't just happening in the southern part of our country, like places like Texas, like where I'm from. I heard you mention Maryland. I know some people think Maryland's down south, depending on where you're from. But these are happening in places that people consider to be like progressive areas, like Maryland, New York, places like that.
Yeah, I mean, and we have to remember that there were counties in New York and California that were covered under the federal preclearance program. So voting discrimination has never been a purely Southern problem, although it is perhaps most acute in the South. It's happened across the country. And what we found is that when you sort of peel back the onion and look, we do find examples of discrimination, especially at the local level, that happen all over the place. I think one of the challenges is that it is really expensive and burdensome to bring a federal Voting Rights Act case. And so oftentimes this kind of local discrimination goes unexamined and unresolved because folks lack the resources to take that on. And that's one of the reasons why state voting rights acts are so important, is because by streamlining that process and actually providing a process where voters and jurisdictions can work collaboratively to resolve discrimination, state VRAs allow us to solve that kind of discrimination at the local level in a much more cost-effective way, and it actually get under the hood and solve some of that local discrimination.
Thanks for that, Adam. Rebecca, I want to get back over to you. Now, I know some of the things we heard Adam talk about, but doesn't the federal VRA of 1965 contain similar protections for everyone across the country? Is it not the panacea? Do we actually need states to enact their own versions?
We absolutely do. And there are a few reasons why. Adam touched on many of them. First is the erosion of the Federal Voting Rights Act by the courts. So we saw in the video of Patrick and Janae, Shelby County v. Holder mentioned. And that is a 2013 United States Supreme Court case that gutted the crown jewel of the Federal Voting Rights Act, known as preclearance. Now, Adam said himself, preclearance, it can be kind of a tricky word, but what it really means is it was able to stop discriminatory policies from being put in place before they could harm people. To stop policies before they could harm people. It's great. We all love that. what the Supreme Court did is they got rid of the formula that told us which states and localities were covered, and that really left the federal program inoperable. And on top of that, Governor Walz mentioned there are new threats that keep popping up. There was a federal court, the Eighth Circuit, that stepped up and said, you know what? For the whole history of the Federal Voting Rights Act, individuals and organizations that protect individuals, they could use it to protect Americans. But that's not true anymore in Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota. No, we're going to strip this pathway away from you. And that's no small matter. Over the past 40 years, there have been roughly at least 182 successful Section 2 claims brought to protect voters under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And only 15 of those were only brought by the government. That means the rest were due to individuals standing up for themselves, using these protections to protect themselves, or organizations doing it for them. And so we keep seeing new attacks like this pop up. But like Governor Walz mentioned, state voting rights acts can actually be used to plug these holes and until Congress takes action. And Congress hasn't yet taken action. So state voting rights acts are a critical way to plug the holes that have been left in the Federal Voting Rights Act. And on top of that, to allow states to expand protections that are not currently offered under the federal VRA and to really tailor it to fit the needs in their communities.
So let me see. I want to make sure I'm not overstating. So do you see state VRAs as replacing the federal VRA that's been weakened, or a stopgap measure until Congress finally acts?
I am so glad you asked that, Demetria. That is probably the number one question I get asked. The answer is neither. So we will never protect everyone's rights in a piecemeal fashion. We absolutely need a national solution to restore and strengthen the freedom to vote via federal legislation. But Congress hasn't acted yet. And so state VRAs can really opt in to fill in and restore voting protections while action is pending in Congress. And then on top of that, should Congress act, which we all hope they do, when they act, they would set a national floor, right? They would put a blanket protections across the country. But state VRAs are still critical because they can offer expanded protections. They can really tailor them to their communities to offer protections that everyone in their states really need. And like Representative Sewell said, state VRAs really help build momentum for restoring the federal VRA. So they're not contradictory. It's not one or the other. They're definitely complements.
All right. Thank you for that explanation. Candace, let's get you in here. Let me ask you this. Is this a new strategy, state VRAs, or have states been actually doing this for a while now?
So state VRAs are not new, but what is new is this incredible momentum behind them. And as Representative Sewell said, California was ahead of the curve back in 2002. And then for a very long time, we saw very little action. Then in 2018, momentum picked up. And since then, we've been off to the races. And with the exception of 2020, we've seen these new laws passed almost every year. And so I'll use the example of the Connecticut VRA, which I helped pass in 2023. It is now considered the most comprehensive in the country. And what's exciting is that we're seeing these laws evolve. They're becoming stronger, more proactive, more intentional. And that shift is because states are truly recognizing that they can no longer wait for Congress to act and they have to lead. And if you want to see exactly where these state VRAs have been passed and where new efforts are emerging, I do encourage you all to visit the map that is on the LDF state VRA landing page. It's just a really great resource that lays out how these laws are expanding and where we're seeing opportunities for next time.
Great, thank you. So everybody check out the website so you can see a little bit more. And who knew that Connecticut would be the leader? No shade on folks from Connecticut, though. Candace, also let me ask you this, folks. We know that with far-reaching policies like state VRAs, even when quite popular, there is an inside strategy that's necessary, but it's not always sufficient. Let me just say, legislators need to hear from constituents, and that's where organizing comes in. And so that's why LDF is so fortunate to have Candace on its team. So that Candace, you played this leading role, as we just heard, in organizing these efforts in on the Connecticut VRA. Candace, tell us, what are some of the challenges and opportunities? Let me say that. Let me just not be negative. What are some of the challenges and opportunities around organizing for state VRAs, in particular VRAs as opposed to just organizing?
Yes, great question. So organizing for state VRAs is unique because it does require a lot of education, and not just on the issue of voting rights itself, but on why these protections matter at the local level. As Adam said earlier, people often think that voter suppression only happens in the Deep South or with high-profile cases, but we also see it in the quieter ways, where the way elections are structured and which neighborhoods are able to get a polling location versus those that don't, and how representation is diluted.
That sounds really local. Okay.
Mhm.
Keep going with that.
And one of the biggest challenges is also helping people see how all of these different issues are interconnected. Even something like the census that helps determine where people live, and then you have the population shifts about how district lines are drawn, which directly impacts elected representation and whether voters are going to actually be able to truly be seen and heard in their communities. And so it's up to us to help connect those dots so that voters understand why this fight matters. And I'd say that even the solution itself can be a challenge at times because it's so technical and multifaceted. There's so many prongs and legal mechanisms. And so we have to break it down so that it's clear, accessible, and actionable for our communities. But the opportunity is just as significant then. This gives us something to fight for instead of just fighting against voter suppression. And so the state VRAs are proactive, is showing communities that we can set the rules instead of just reacting to them. And when we combine that vision with people's lived experiences and we're truly listening to them and we're building out these multiracial coalitions that are able to reflect the diversity in the communities we serve, we've been able to energize people and bring them together in this fight in ways that we haven't seen before.
You know, people are kind of tired of fighting against something. So to have something to fight for is kind of refreshing and energizing. So thank you for that. So Candace, in addition to being an organizer, as I kind of let the audience know a little earlier, Candace is a proud Southerner from Louisiana. Not Texas, but Louisiana, but that's okay. You're a neighbor. Listen, Representative Sewell mentioned that we're actually starting to see state VRAs introduced in the South, and it's long been a part of LDF's long-term vision to work with local partners in the South. And so we'd love to see some development here of state VRAs, which seem to make sense, right, in the southern part. And so you're playing a critical role in this effort. What do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities in doing the work in the South in particular? I know you worked in Connecticut, but what challenges and opportunities do you see in the South?
There's so much to love about the South. And unfortunately, when it comes to voting rights, not so much. So the political climate in the South, particularly in states like Florida, where my colleagues are working so diligently to pass a state VRA, it is incredibly hostile to pro-voter policies. And that hostility doesn't just create barriers to passing strong protections, but it's also fueling voter apathy. When people have been disenfranchised for generations, it's hard for them to believe that things can change. And so that's an unfortunate reality that we're up against, and it can make the work more challenging. But as someone who grew up in the Deep South, I also know that this region has a legacy of resilience. And if I may quote Outkast, they once said, the South
I love Outkast.
The South got something to say. And this is where some of the most historical civil rights battles were fought. And it is that spirit that continues to inspire action today. And so the state VRAs give us an incredible opportunity to build on that legacy by rallying communities around a positive vision. It's about more than defending voting rights. It's about creating systems that will empower and represent all of us. So in many ways, the South is the heart of this fight, and the stakes couldn't be higher, but neither could the potential for real transformative change.
Now, give me that Outcast quote one more time, please.
The South got something to say.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much, Candace. Adam, let me turn to you now. Now, listen, another challenge that we often face with civil rights legislation, really in the current environment we're in, is in the courts. In the courts, Adam. Now, Rebecca talked about how the courts have undercut federal VRA with state VRAs faring a little better. Do you think state VRAs are faring a little better? Maybe. I mean, the courts are tough, right? So, I mean, for example, if the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court struck down the federal pre-clearance program in Shelby County, how can states like New York, Connecticut create their own pre-clearance protections? I mean, if we don't have it at the federal level, how are we going to have them in the state courts?
It's a great question, and it's certainly one, as Rebecca mentioned, that we get a lot. First, starting with respect to pre-clearance, it's really important to remember, as Rebecca said earlier, that the Supreme Court did not actually strike down pre-clearance as a concept. The court invalidated the particular framework that Congress used to determine which jurisdictions would be in or out of the program. And so the court, said explicitly that Congress could potentially change that and bring back pre-clearance, and that's what we're fighting for on the federal level. So that means at the state level, states are free to create their own pre-clearance programs. The programs that have been enacted in New York and Connecticut speak to the concerns that the court has raised in Shelby, most specifically about making sure that coverage under pre-clearance is in response to what the court called current conditions and concerns, right? So discrimination that's happened recently. So those programs speak directly to that concern. And also states have a bit more leeway than the federal government on this topic because there aren't the same kind of federalism concerns that the court has raised as well. So with respect to pre-clearance, as I mentioned, the New York program is active. It's on firm ground. In addition, courts in California, Washington, and New York State have all looked at their state voting rights acts and determined them to be constitutional. There was one exception in New York where a lower court struck down or purported to strike down the New York Voting Rights Act as unconstitutional. But I'm thrilled to report that literally today, the appellate court reversed that decision, which we expected to happen quickly and decisively because that decision was so faulty and such an outlier. So I would say that state legislators, advocates can move forward with confidence that state level voting rights acts are on firm constitutional ground. And we have a robust opportunity to assert that in the courts going forward.
Well, that's refreshing. That's refreshing to hear, and it's very exciting to hear that new result out of New York. Very exciting stuff. Rebecca,
we're kind enough to do that right before our event today, so we could announce that to this.
Perfect timing, Adam. Rebecca, so today we're here to launch a video explainer series. Why did you all decide to even create this video explainer series? Why?
Yeah, this came out of a conversation that Adam was really having with local partners who are working to deeply engage in their communities and looking for tools to help educate folks on the basics of state VRAs. You know, we like to say that voting rights is simple. One person, one vote. Everyone deserves a chance to participate. You know, your vote is your voice, and your voice should be heard on an equal basis. These are just really simple things, or should be simple, that we fight for. But voting rights law that underpins all this and allows this to be upheld and protected can be technical and really complicated and complex. So we really wanted to provide a resource that breaks this all down and gets at the heart of what a state VRA is and how it can protect you and your right to vote.
You know, and I think that really makes sense based on even what Candace said, right? People need to understand what's going on. They know what they're experiencing, but to explain this in a way that really breaks it down, I think is really smart. All right, I got a couple questions for all of you guys. You guys answered as you'd like. My first one is, what are you most excited about in 2025 with respect to the state VRA strategy? And anyone can start.
Sure, I'll go. For me, it's about the expansion of this movement into the South, because we realize that it's not just a policy idea anymore. It's a tested strategy that is winning and has won in multiple states. And so seeing that energy move into Southern states, my home of Louisiana, where voting rights are constantly under attack, that's what excites me most, because the VRAs are not just about preventing harm, but about building power, securing protections, and making sure that every voter, Black, Brown, Indigenous, immigrant, has a real voice. And I think 2025 is a year to go on the offense.
I'll jump in and say that I'm most excited about turning a negative into a positive. So, as a result of the most recent elections, we're facing attacks and not progress on the federal level. We've already seen the Trump administration reverse the DOJ position on key voting rights cases, one that's going to the Supreme Court that LDF is litigating. We know the Project 2025 agenda involves gutting enforcement of voting rights. We know that Congress is likely to put up within the next couple of weeks a piece of legislation that attacks Latino voters, would undercut voter registration drives, and put onerous barriers in front of everyone who's trying to get on the rolls, and then likely result in purges from those rolls. So we know these attacks are going to be coming. But the positive, there's no positive side of that, but the result of that is that at the state level, people understand that this state level Voting Rights Act strategy is a concrete and key way to respond to those attacks. And so we are seeing that increased momentum now at the state level. Just as an example, the Legal Defense Fund and our partners host a monthly call of advocates working on state level voting rights acts. And just this past month, we had presentations from 8 states who are working, 4 states who have active public campaigns going on right now, and 4 states who are building more slowly to roll out campaigns for state level voting rights. And even that didn't cover the full landscape. So I'm excited about the expanding map that we're going to see in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, I hate to sound like a broken record here, but that's what excites me too, right? In policy land, it's always easy to say that you're against something or to constantly be on the defense or to put out another white paper, another idea, but to actually have a real piece of legislation that has been passed, is getting passed, that states are stepping up and doing, is incredible. And to actually see the progress being made, it's something that we all dream of, and if we could see more progress during our lifetimes, that would be plenty for me.
All right. Well, I'm running out of time here, so my next question, I want you to try to answer it in 3 words, if you could. All right. All right. I'm gonna go with you, Adam, first. If our audience today only remembers one thing about state VRAs, let's say 2 months from now, what would that one thing be? I'll give you 5 words.
Okay, states taking national leadership, addressing a critical local need.
Okay, all right. Candace?
I'm from the South, so I don't have a choice but to be a little bit long-winded. It'll be 8 words. Policies don't move people, people move policies.
All right, we'll take that one. Rebecca?
Real laws that can be passed today in your state.
All right. All right, folks, you got that? Write that down. Tell your friends. Share the video later. And right now, I'm going to pass it over to Adam. It's been great chatting with you today. I hope you learned something. I certainly did. And get out there and get active on this stuff. Thanks. Adam?
Sure. Thank you so much, Demetria. Adam Liaz, again, Senior Policy Counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. I want to thank everyone for joining today. It was fabulous to have so many people given everything else that's going on. I want to thank Representative Sewell, Governor Walz, and the teams at CAP and LDF for bringing this event together, and especially for putting together this video series, which is going to be fantastic. And it's been a really strong partnership. For me, the key takeaway here, to build on Demetria's last question, is that state VRAs are a powerful, popular policy that can protect Black voters in the here and now, and one that has tremendous momentum. You can find the video explainer on CAP's and LDF's website, and we'll be posting that in a recording of the event as well. And if we could put up the final slide as well, you can see that we have contact information here. You can find the polling that I discussed again on LDF State VRA landing page. Anyone who has questions can reach out to us at these email addresses, or if you want to request access to the polling, the messaging guidance, and that will filter back to us and we can get back to you. Please check the CAP and LDF websites regularly going forward for those monthly State VRA Video Explainer Series videos that will be posted from now through June. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today.